Welcome, my soft-thinking listener. You found yourself in the company of the Sleepy Sloth once again. A slow, scientifically minded fellow, who enjoys facts, threads, and the quiet hush of textiles being woven, very, very slowly. I must tell you something before we begin. Today, I consider myself a scientist in fabrics. A scientist wannabe who is almost always correct. Except, perhaps, when I am not. But even then, I prefer to drift gently onward, following the quiet rhythm of a loom rather than fussing over the knots of error. Because what truly matters is the information itself. Before I start, please let me know, what is the most boring thing you would secretly love hearing about? Let me know gently in the comments. Now, let us begin today's episode of The Unhurried History of Textiles. Long before the hum of modern machinery, somewhere around the 1st century of our shared timeline, there was the gentle rise of cotton textiles in India. Around 1 CE, these fine threads began their slow and steady journey across regions, through trade routes that shimmered faintly with dust and sun. Cotton, soft, breathable, and delightfully unassuming, was spun into fabrics that traveled by sea and sand, carried by merchants who likely never realized that their bundles of cloth would one day be seen as historical milestones. Each fiber was twisted from lint to thread, from thread to cloth, from cloth to quiet commerce. The cotton's microscopic structure, its hollow fibers, made it absorbent, durable, and oddly comforting to touch, even then. It was perhaps the most patient of all textiles. A perfect companion for civilizations that valued stillness as much as function. Let us drift, ever so slowly, eastward, to 50 CE, where in China, silk weaving had reached a level of quiet perfection. The mulberry silkworm, Bombyx mori, was the small and sleepy artisan behind this transformation. Imagine thousands of cocoons, each carefully softened in warm water, their delicate threads unwound into impossibly long filaments, often up to 900 meters from a single cocoon. The weavers of China did not rush. Their looms moved like a breath. The silk, shimmering faintly under lamplight, became not only fabric but also art, carrying patterns of clouds, dragons, and flowers that fluttered like dreams. Yet the most beautiful part was not the pattern itself, but the patience, the unhurried precision required to weave threads so fine they seemed almost invisible. No one asked for this level of dedication. And yet, there it was. We drift now to Egypt, around 100 CE. The air is warm, and in tombs and temples, linen and wool rest quietly beside their sleeping owners. Linen, woven from the flax plant, was crisp, cool, and eternally patient. It wrapped the bodies of the departed, layer upon layer, each strand whispering of preparation and permanence. Wool, with its gentle lanolin scent, was more forgiving, soft, insulating, slightly irregular. Together they told a story of texture, of heat and dryness and devotion to detail. The Egyptians did not think of comfort as we do. For them, fabric was continuity, something to travel with, even beyond life. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, the linen used in Egyptian tombs was sometimes reused from household cloths, carefully washed, bleached by the sun, and rewoven, because fibers, like memories, were not wasted. Let us move gently forward to Greece, around 150 CE. Here, textiles began to appear not just in daily life but in literature and art. Homer and later writers described fabrics as metaphors for order, destiny, and domestic life, the loom, a symbol of steady creation. Greek women, in poems and pottery alike, are shown weaving at home, their movements repetitive, timeless, rhythmic. Cloth was more than material, it was narrative, connecting household to cosmos. A thread was not merely spun, it was stretched between meaning and matter. The philosopher might ponder the tension of the warp and weft, while a humble weaver simply continued. One pass at a time. Around 200 CE, we return to India, where cotton weaving expanded through growing trade networks. The subcontinent had become a tapestry of small workshops and domestic looms. The dyes, indigo, madder, turmeric, created quiet brilliance on humble cloth. Patterns emerged that spoke of both patience and pride. Each region developed its own textures, its own methods of resist dyeing or block printing. Yet even then, the rhythm was slow, deliberate. Trade winds carried bolts of fabric outward, toward Arabia, Africa, and Rome, but the process of making each bolt remained local, personal, intimate. Cotton, again, remained the hero of the ordinary, never loud, never rushed, just eternally useful. And at last, around 250 CE, we drift back to China, where silk weaving had become standardized, not for art alone but for commerce. Official looms were built according to government patterns, quality was measured, documented, controlled. The empire's bureaucratic stillness extended even to thread counts. Imagine a world where someone's daily duty was to measure the fineness of silk, counting threads per inch, ensuring every roll met imperial standards. It may sound dull, but to the sleepy sloth, it is a lullaby of logic, a harmony of quiet perfection. Each silk strand recorded, each pattern approved, each piece folded and stored. Softly now. Let us drift to the warm winds and sandy plains of Mesopotamia, around the year 300 of our time. A place where cloth was not merely something worn or wrapped, but something traded, an invisible thread tying distant lands together. The weaving of textiles had become a part of long-distance trade, the kind that moved so slowly that months might pass between one harbor and the next. Cloths of linen, wool, and cotton were carried upon the backs of camels or stored within riverboats that glided silently along the Tigris and the Euphrates. The air would have been thick with dust and the faint scent of oil and fiber. Merchants counted bales with care, each roll of fabric representing not just wealth, but work, hours of spinning, dyeing, and weaving, every thread pulled and twisted by human hands. In the stillness of early dawn, markets might have shimmered with these quiet colors, ochres, deep reds, faded blues, all derived from the gentle insistence of plants, minerals, and insects. Textiles were among the most valuable items to travel such distances because they carried not only beauty but also portability, soft, foldable treasures that could cross mountains and deserts without complaint. And yet, even then, few would have paused to think of the stories woven into the cloth itself, the fingerprints of those who touched the loom before it began its slow journey across continents. Ever so slowly, we move westward, toward the banks of the Nile, around the year 350 of our time, where Egypt's cities had begun to hum quietly with the rhythm of textile workshops. Within the narrow streets of places like Alexandria and Antinoe, looms clacked with a gentle monotony, filling courtyards with soft, fibrous music. The workshops were part of an organized craft economy, where spinning, dyeing, and weaving were divided into careful tasks. Wool, linen, and sometimes imported cotton were transformed into tunics and draperies for the living, and wrappings for the departed. The air itself was full of life and dust and fiber, floating like invisible snow. In these spaces, artisans often worked in the shadow of temples or government buildings, their craft so essential that even taxes could be paid in cloth. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, some Egyptian looms of this era used horizontal tensioning weights made of clay, small and round, holding the warp threads steady. These humble tools ensured that every line of fabric remained smooth, balanced, precise. Such care, given to something so ordinary, is quietly beautiful. Each motion of the weaver's hand was a continuation of traditions older than the buildings themselves, a heritage passed down not in books, but through rhythm and muscle memory. Let us drift eastward again, to the warmth of India, somewhere around the year 400 of our time. Here, the mastery of cotton had evolved into something serene and remarkable. The cotton plant, with its soft white bolls, gave rise to fabrics of delicate lightness, woven so finely that travelers compared them to woven air. These textiles were dyed using natural pigments, madder for deep reds, turmeric for glowing yellows, and indigo for calm, endless blues. Each dye required patient preparation, soaking, fermenting, and fixing with minerals that the artisans understood not by written science, but through ancestral observation. The process was slow, methodical, filled with pauses. Colors would rest under the sun, deepening quietly day by day. Even the water used to rinse the cloth was considered with care, for the mineral balance could shift the hue in subtle, unpredictable ways. To touch these fabrics was to feel time itself, compressed into softness. Some patterns were printed using carved wooden blocks, pressed gently into the surface of the cloth like half-forgotten sighs. And so, through patient hands, India became not just a source of fabric, but a source of wonder for distant lands that could scarcely imagine how something so soft could hold so much effort within its weave. We float onward. To China, around the year 450 of our time, where silk, that most secretive of fibers, began to travel outward along trade routes that later would be called the Silk Road. The shimmering thread, born from the humble cocoon of the mulberry silkworm, carried both mystery and prestige. The art of silk weaving was no longer a guarded secret within the empire, it began to ripple outward, carried by merchants, monks, and wanderers. The weaving techniques, intricate and delicate, moved with them, carried as whispers rather than written instructions. Imagine, for a moment, the stillness of a workshop where silk threads hung like mist, barely visible, swaying with each breath of air. The looms were often upright, allowing the fabric to descend slowly as it was woven, gravity lending its quiet hand to the process. Colors shimmered faintly, soft golds, mossy greens, pale whites that reflected light in a way no other fabric could. But perhaps the most tranquil detail was the silence of it all, the faint tapping of wood, the occasional sigh of the weaver, the quiet patience of hands that knew their motion by memory alone. Silk was more than trade, it was conversation through texture, connection through thread. And now, let us move gently toward Europe, around the year 500 of our time, where the Roman territories, though changing and uncertain, had begun to nurture textile workshops of their own. These were places of steady production, where flax, wool, and occasionally imported silk were turned into garments for citizens, soldiers, and priests alike. The Romans had long valued order, and their textile industry reflected that calm predictability. Workshops, or philoniki, were established within cities, often near sources of water. Workers used large stone vats to wash, bleach, and thicken fabrics, a process that sometimes involved the mild, earthy scent of fermented substances. Within these walls, textile work was communal, repetitive, and endlessly methodical. Each garment was not merely sewn, but structured according to rules of pattern and proportion. There was beauty in that precision, though it was a quiet, uncelebrated beauty. The Roman tunic, the most basic of garments, remained largely unchanged for centuries, as though perfection had been found in simplicity itself. And though the empire's boundaries wavered and its power shifted, the steady rhythm of weaving, spinning, and dyeing continued, like a heartbeat beneath the noise of history. Softly still, we drift back toward the Indian subcontinent, around the year 550 of our time, where weaving techniques had become refined beyond what earlier generations could have imagined. The artisans of this period pursued fineness, fabrics so light they could pass through a ring, and yet so strong that they endured repeated washings. New methods of spinning cotton allowed for tighter, more uniform threads, which in turn produced smoother weaves. Looms became more sophisticated, enabling more complex patterns and finer adjustments in tension. It was, in essence, a quiet revolution, one that unfolded not with noise or invention, but with care and continuity. The dyes grew subtler, the weaves more even, the craftsmanship more invisible. Every improvement, though tiny, was a whisper of progress. But first, A slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, these refined cottons, when exported, often baffled foreign weavers, who could not replicate the texture or the evenness of the threads. Some thought the secret lay in the soil, others in the water, and perhaps they were all correct. For the truth is that weaving, like all patient crafts, is not a science alone, it is a dialogue between hands, fiber, and time itself. Softly, as though gliding along the edge of a silken thread, we drift toward China around the year 600 of our time, when the empire's mastery of silk production reached a quiet and shimmering perfection. Within the calm, disciplined rhythm of imperial workshops, the cultivation of silkworms had become not just an art but a science, guided by official standards and gentle precision. The mulberry leaves were grown in tended groves, their delicate veins carefully observed to ensure the health of the worms that depended on them. Each silkworm, fed and protected with near reverence, spun its cocoon in the same slow spiral motion, unaware that its thread would soon find its way into the robes of emperors or the veils of distant nobles. Inspectors, trained in the unhurried scrutiny of texture, would pass their hands over finished fabrics, feeling for evenness and weight. The imperial standards dictated color tones, thread density, and sheen, all codified into lists that reflected the empire's longing for order and control. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, some records describe that even the spacing of decorative patterns, such as cloud motifs or paired phoenixes, was measured according to mathematical ratios, as if the sky itself had been woven into fabric. It was a time when cloth was both beauty and bureaucracy, every roll of silk a quiet record of patience and perfection. From there, we drift westward, as though carried on a soft trade wind, to the Middle East around the year 650 of our time, when the textile trade stretched outward to North Africa and Europe. The weaving centers of Syria, Persia, and Egypt became luminous crossroads of technique and texture. Here, looms clacked gently in courtyards shaded from the sun, where dyers stirred great vats of color, saffron, indigo, and cochineal, each hue shimmering faintly in the light of late afternoon. Caravans moved along old trade routes, their goods packed in woven sacks that themselves were small works of craftsmanship. These were not hurried exchanges, each journey was a patient negotiation between distance and desire. Fabrics of linen, wool, and silk passed through bazaars fragrant with spices, their threads absorbing whispers of languages from across continents. And in quiet corners of the desert, even nomads traded small woven bands, symbols of alliance, gifts of soft labor. The expansion of textile trade during this time was not merely economic but deeply cultural. Patterns from Persia influenced the looms of Byzantium, while North African motifs found their way into Spanish workshops. Each crossing left behind faint echoes of another civilization, a shared thread in humanity's long weave. With slow and steady warmth, we drift once again toward India, around the year 700 of our time, when cotton weaving began to integrate into the palace workshops of royal courts. These were places not of haste but of refined stillness, where artisans wove under the watchful gaze of patrons who prized the precision of human hands. The looms here were larger, more intricate, their rhythmic wooden tapping blending with the quiet conversations of weavers. Cotton, by now, had become the cloth of comfort and pride, favored for its softness and adaptability. In these palace ateliers, cotton fabrics were often embroidered with silk threads, sometimes adorned with gold leaf or tiny mirrors that caught the faintest glimmers of torchlight. Each piece of cloth could take months to complete, its surface carrying the careful geometry of design schools passed down through generations. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, the royal looms often used a special tool called the tanchoy shuttle, enabling the creation of patterns so dense they appeared almost painted. To watch a weaver guide the shuttle back and forth was like watching someone paint with thread, every stroke deliberate, every motion a meditation. Drifting onward like a silk ribbon caught in a mild breeze, we find ourselves once again in China, around the year 750 of our time, under the Tang dynasty's golden calm. Here, silk weaving reached new heights of refinement, and artistry that turned texture into poetry. The Tang court loved silk not only for its softness but for its ability to hold light, to shimmer like morning fog upon a river. Workshops in Chang'an and Luoyang were filled with master weavers who perfected the Jin and Konggu techniques, weaving gold threads into complex brocades that depicted clouds, birds, and floral motifs with hypnotic precision. The process was so deliberate that even a small section of patterned silk might require weeks of work. The Tang emperors sent these fabrics as diplomatic gifts, their intricate threads carrying silent messages of prestige and grace. Within the capital, looms stood tall and patient, their rhythmic sounds echoing like heartbeats within wooden halls. The weavers themselves often remained anonymous, their artistry woven quietly into the empire's identity. Silk, by this point, was no longer merely a product, it was a form of quiet communication between cultures, a way to speak softly across great distances without words. We move slowly westward again, toward Europe, particularly the Iberian Peninsula, around the year 800 of our time, where new sounds filled the air, the hum of Islamic weaving techniques introduced during the early centuries of Moorish rule in Spain. These methods, born from centuries of craft in Damascus and Baghdad, carried with them an intricate understanding of color harmony and geometry. Looms in Al-Andalus began producing textiles rich with interlacing patterns, delicate star shapes, calligraphic curves, and the endless repetition of motifs that mirrored the infinite. The introduction of silk weaving in this region transformed local economies, turning cities like Córdoba and Granada into quiet centers of textile brilliance. The techniques combined local European fibers with imported silks, blending cultures not through words or conquest, but through thread. Workshops became living mosaics of influence. Persian pattern systems met Roman dyes, while North African craftsmanship mingled with European tastes. And yet, for all its sophistication, the rhythm of weaving remained the same, slow, steady, meditative. Each artisan, whether in Spain or Syria, performed the same timeless gestures, the lift of a shuttle, the pull of a warp, the soft exhale of concentration. As we linger still within the subcontinent, around the year 850 of our time, the regions of Gujarat and Bengal emerge in quiet brilliance. Here, cotton weaving flourished under both domestic and commercial devotion. Gujarat's coastal cities thrived as centers for the export of fine cotton, their ports alive with boats carrying bales of hand-woven fabric toward Arabia and Africa. Bengal, with its humid air and fertile soil, produced cotton of such softness that it became legendary, the ancestor of the later muslin that would captivate the world. The artisans here understood fiber intimately, they spun thread so fine it could scarcely be seen in dim light, relying on the feel rather than the sight of the thread between their fingers. The dyes were natural, the patterns hand-printed or woven directly into the cloth. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, the water from the Ganges Delta, rich in particular minerals, was said to lend a special sheen to the fabric, one that dyers elsewhere could never quite replicate. The weavers of Gujarat and Bengal did not rush, their work unfolded in rhythm with the monsoon and the seasons, each thread an act of patience, each color a quiet echo of the land itself. And somewhere further east, by the time we reach around the year 900 of our time, the silken world of China shimmered once again with trade and abundance. The weaving of silk fabrics had become a vast network of artisans, merchants, and travelers stretching across the breadth of Asia. From the looms of Hangzhou to the caravans that wound through Dunhuang and beyond, silk moved like a quiet current through civilizations. Workshops refined the use of drawlooms, allowing complex designs, dragons, clouds, flowering branches, to be rendered with exquisite precision. In the ports along the southern coast, silk awaited ships bound for Japan, Korea, and lands even farther beyond, where it would be treasured as something nearly divine. Yet within the weaving halls themselves, life remained slow, predictable, beautifully repetitive. The weaver's world was measured not in miles or coins, but in inches of finished cloth, in hours of steady concentration. The air smelled faintly of mulberry and oil, the soundscape one of soft tension and release. Silk had become not merely a symbol of beauty, but of continuity, the fabric that tied generations and empires together, unbroken, unhurried, endlessly shimmering in the light. And so, the quiet story of threads begins to stretch and wander, not as lines upon a map, but as delicate filaments carried by hands, wind, and centuries. Around the year 950 of our time, in the warm and sun-colored markets of the Middle East, textiles began their long, intricate journeys outward. These were not simple pieces of fabric, but woven expressions of place and imagination, silk that shimmered like captured dawnlight, cotton soft as breath, and wool dyed in hues that told silent tales of earth and sky. From the ports along the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, merchants set forth with their bales packed tight in wooden ships, their sails filled with trade winds that carried not just goods, but ideas, patterns, and the memory of human touch. One can almost imagine the slow rhythm of weaving looms mingling with the pulse of caravan bells, threads connecting distant lands, one patient knot at a time. And then, with the gentle turning of a century, around 1,000 years into our time, something began to hum quietly in the stone streets of European towns. The first textile guilds took form, not merely as groups of craftsmen, but as woven societies of their own, built on trust, apprenticeship, and pride. In candlelit workshops, spindles turned, looms creaked, and wool fibers whispered together under practiced hands. Each guild guarded its secrets as if they were living things, the right tension of the warp, the recipes for dyes drawn from plants and minerals, the quiet discipline of measuring, cutting, and finishing. These communities, though small, began to shape entire cities. Textiles were not only clothing now, they became markers of belonging, of region, and of human order, the way fabric itself might represent a kind of social weave, a pattern repeating across time. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting thread of the tale, far to the east, around the year 1050 of our time, in the refined workshops of China, silk weaving reached new levels of delicacy. Artisans there worked as though in conversation with the material itself, coaxing from the shimmering threads robes so fine they seemed woven from moonlight and patience. Imperial courts treasured them, not only for their beauty but for their symbolism, each pattern an emblem of harmony, virtue, or celestial balance. The craft had already been ancient by then, and yet it evolved with the grace of something that knew how to renew itself endlessly, flowing like a river through generations. The methods were documented with precision, guarded in families and imperial workshops, yet the results, the silks themselves, drifted outward across the known world, crossing deserts and seas, carrying with them an almost weightless sense of refinement. And softly, as trade winds shifted again, the story drifted southward to the great subcontinent of India, where, around 1100 years of our time, cotton weaving was recorded in handwritten manuscripts, delicate as the fibers they described. Cotton, that humble, sun-loving plant, became the foundation of an entire artistic language. The manuscripts spoke of tension, twist, and the interplay of thread and dye, but behind the words lived a rhythm, a deeply human continuity of craft. Looms stood in courtyards shaded by palms, and weavers worked by touch and intuition, their fingers guiding each fiber with care. In this world, fabric was not merely useful, it was spiritual, carrying the breath of its maker. One could almost feel the hush of that ancient workroom, the pause before each throw of the shuttle, the kind of quiet where time itself seems to slow and listen. And gently onward. As we move toward about 1150 years of our time, we find ourselves once again beneath the gray skies of Europe, where the wool weaving industry began to bloom across Flanders and England. Here, the damp climate was kind to sheep, and their wool became a kind of currency, a texture that built towns and fortunes. The looms grew larger, the dyes deeper, and trade routes stretched outward toward distant markets. Entire communities revolved around this rhythm, from shepherds on misty hillsides to fullers, dyers, and merchants who packed their goods for export. The air of the towns carried the mingled sense of lanolin, smoke, and earth, a fragrance of labor, of patience, and of soft, enduring craft. And through it all, threads continued their endless conversation, crossing borders, whispering the story of humanity's need not only for warmth, but for beauty made by hand. But perhaps, let us wander a little further east again, to around 1200 years of our time, where silk once more shimmered beneath lantern light in the imperial courts of China. There, it was not merely clothing but language, each fold of a robe, each embroidered crane or cloud motif, a quiet declaration of grace and order. The weavers who created these garments were invisible in history's records, yet their touch remains in every preserved thread, an artistry so precise it defies the passage of centuries. The silks of this period reflected an empire's calm confidence, its harmony between material and meaning, a softness that radiated outward, almost like music made visible. And so, as the years drifted on toward about 1250 of our time, the Middle East once again became a living crossroads. Textiles flowed outward toward both Europe and Asia, carried by caravans that glittered faintly under the sun, silks, cottons, and woolens mingling in a choreography of trade. The fabrics told of distant reigns and foreign dyes, of merchants who spoke in many tongues yet understood one another perfectly through the universal language of cloth. In these markets, texture itself became a map, a silk pattern hinting of China, a wool weave speaking of the north, a cotton print murmuring of India. The world was learning, thread by thread, to recognize itself as connected. And in a warm, rhythmic breath of time later, around 1300 years of our time, India's cotton weaving flourished both in its bustling cities and its quiet villages. The looms sang in harmony with daily life, their wooden frames creaking softly beside courtyards filled with light. Artisans experimented with new techniques, resist dyeing, block printing, fine muslin that seemed to float rather than rest upon the skin. The beauty of this craft lay in its generosity, the way a simple woven length of cotton could serve rich and poor alike, functional yet radiant, ordinary yet deeply human. Cotton cloth, humble and soft, became the thread that tied together domestic work, artistic pride, and the quiet heartbeat of an entire land. And still, the story of textiles continues to drift onward, soft as the weave itself, each thread holding within it not only the weight of history, but the shimmer of touch, the warmth of hands, and the quiet, ongoing dream of connection through cloth. And softly, as the threads of time drifted toward about 1350 years of our time, the hum of weaving became the quiet pulse of European cities. Streets that once echoed with the sound of carts and horses now carried the rhythmic clatter of looms and the gentle whir of spinning wheels. Textiles were no longer a craft practiced on the margins of town, they had become the lifeblood of the urban economy, woven deep into the structure of everyday life. Guilds grew stronger, workshops multiplied, and merchants learned to read the language of fabric as clearly as letters on a page. A bolt of fine wool might travel from a spinner's attic room to the hands of a noble tailor, while coarse linens filled the homes of working families. Every thread represented a chain of labor, the shepherd's tending, the spinner's patience, the dyer's experimentations with color, and the weaver's careful beat of the shuttle. The air of these growing towns carried both the scent of wet wool and the faint sweetness of madder root, that ancient red dye coaxed from the earth. In those years, textiles were not just trade, they were identity, craftsmanship, and livelihood, binding the fates of city and countryside into one soft, continuous weave. And then, with a slow turn eastward, the story glimmers beneath lantern light, around 1400 years of our time, when silk weaving in China reached a quiet, luminous perfection under the Ming dynasty. Workshops glowed with steady labor, where weavers guided fine threads through complex looms with movements as fluid as water. The silks of this age carried colors both muted and magnificent, deep vermilions, celadon greens, and gold threads fine as breath. Patterns often echoed nature itself, cranes in flight, clouds in slow procession, waves curving in graceful repetition. Each robe or hanging was not merely decoration, but a form of storytelling, expressing cosmic harmony and the ideals of balance that shaped Ming art and philosophy. The empire's weaving centers, such as Suzhou, became places of near-poetic precision, where the act of creating cloth was akin to meditation, each motion a quiet devotion to beauty. The imperial court prized these textiles as symbols of refinement and order, yet they also traveled far beyond palace walls, carried through trade routes that extended into Southeast Asia, Persia, and eventually toward the West. It is almost dreamlike to imagine these luminous fabrics folding time and distance into their fibers, carrying the touch of human artistry across mountains and oceans. And softly onward. As we drift toward around 1450 years of our time, a subtle revolution began in the weaving towns of Flanders and northern Italy. Here, the introduction of the horizontal loom, a quiet but transformative invention, reshaped the rhythm of textile work. No longer bound to upright frames, weavers could now work more comfortably and efficiently, seated at looms that allowed for wider and more complex fabrics. It was a small shift in structure, but a vast one in meaning. The new looms expanded the scale of production, and with it, the imagination of design. Fabrics could now hold intricate geometric patterns, layered textures, and repeating motifs that seemed to ripple like sound. Workshops became orchestras of motion, the steady tapping of treadles, the smooth slide of shuttles, the rustle of cloth being rolled and measured. This mechanical grace did not diminish the artistry, rather, it deepened it, allowing craftspeople to express new levels of mastery. In places like Bruges and Florence, cloth became not just a necessity, but a symbol of civic pride, a reflection of how human ingenuity could refine the simple act of weaving into a dance of technology and tradition. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting thread that carries us southward again, to about 1500 years of our time, where the lands of India continued to hum with the steady music of cotton weaving. Trade had carried these techniques outward for centuries, yet it was during this era that Indian cottons truly became global treasures. The light, breathable fabric, often adorned with block-printed patterns or hand-painted designs, captivated merchants from Arabia, Africa, and Europe alike. Chintz, calico, and muslin were not mere cloths but marvels of precision, threads spun so fine they seemed almost invisible, dyes that resisted fading under fierce sun, and patterns whose symmetry echoed natural perfection. These textiles became ambassadors of craft, carried aboard ships that crossed monsoon seas and desert caravans that followed the stars. And behind each bolt of cloth lay entire communities, spinners, dyers, printers, and weavers, whose expertise was passed through generations, taught not in books but by touch, by memory, by rhythm. The cotton cloth of India did not simply wrap the body, it wrapped the world in its softness, reshaping taste, commerce, and imagination. And quietly, with the gentle murmur of progress, the story drifts toward about 1550 years of our time, when Europe's wool weaving and dyeing reached new sophistication. The knowledge gathered from centuries of practice began to merge with chemistry and observation. Dyers experimented with controlled mordants, refining the way colors bonded to fiber, deepening blues and fixing reds so they would endure through years of wear and washing. Workshops in England, the Low Countries, and parts of France thrived on this alchemy, their vats steaming in winter air, their wool drying on racks beside running streams. The shades achieved during this time, rich indigos, smoky charcoals, and velvety crimsons, spoke of both science and patience. Wool itself, long regarded as humble, began to rival silk in beauty. In the guild halls of weavers and fullers, discussions of texture, tension, and tone carried a quiet reverence, as though color itself were a kind of prayer. Each dyed thread represented not only craft, but care, a devotion to the idea that even the most ordinary fabric could hold within it something luminous, something enduring, something softly alive. And gently, as the tides of time drifted toward around 1600 years of our time, silk began to travel not only along the great land routes that once wound through the deserts and mountains of Asia, but also across the shining surfaces of the sea. Chinese silk, shimmering like liquid moonlight, moved through the ports of the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, carried on ships whose sails filled with warm monsoon winds. The threads that had once traveled by camel now floated by water, soft and patient, stretching the boundaries of the known world. These maritime routes connected distant ports, from the coasts of Fujian and Guangdong to places like Malacca, Calicut, and all the way to the Persian Gulf. Silk became both treasure and storyteller, exchanged for spices, precious woods, and silver. In the weaving centers of Suzhou and Hangzhou, artisans continued their slow, careful work, creating fabrics so light they seemed to drift like breath itself. And as the ships departed, the silks carried more than beauty, they carried ideas, aesthetics, fragments of culture that whispered between civilizations. Each voyage was not just a transaction but a gentle weaving of worlds, as soft as a current beneath a ship's keel. And then, with the quiet hum of progress, around 1650 years into our time, Europe began to change the rhythm of its looms. Mechanical aids, small innovations, yet deeply symbolic, began to make their way into workshops that had long depended only on the human hand. Simple devices like the flying shuttle, invented by John Kay, allowed weavers to pass the weft through threads more swiftly, widening the cloth and doubling production without losing the artistry that defined the work. In dusty workshops lit by candlelight, one could almost hear the shift, a slightly quicker clatter, a more confident rhythm, a new kind of efficiency that felt both thrilling and strange. These small mechanical whispers marked the beginning of a transformation. Weaving was still a craft, but it was beginning to lean toward something larger, something that blurred the line between human touch and machine motion. The loom, once a solitary partner of the artisan, began to hint at a future filled with wheels, gears, and humming factories, though, for now, it remained a quiet revolution, unfolding thread by thread. And softly onward we drift, toward around 1700 years of our time, where the looms of India sang with a steady, resonant beauty. Cotton fabrics, the pride of centuries of craftsmanship, found their way to markets across the world. Indian weavers had long mastered techniques of spinning and dyeing that gave rise to textiles of astonishing fineness. Muslin from Bengal was so delicate it was said to pass through a ring, chintz from the Coromandel coast dazzled with its intricate floral patterns, calico from Gujarat carried vibrant prints that seemed to bloom under sunlight. The trade networks that carried these fabrics stretched wide, to Arabia, East Africa, and all the way to Europe, where merchants eagerly awaited each ship's arrival. The fabrics were not merely goods, they were ambassadors of a vast and ancient tradition. Every pattern told a story, each dye spoke of the land and its elements, indigo from the plant's deep green leaves, red from the madder root, yellow from turmeric. And behind every bolt of cotton lay entire ecosystems of human skill, spinners with their wheels, dyers with their vats, weavers guiding the shuttles through endless hours of rhythm. The fabric itself became a language, whispering across oceans that beauty could be both useful and eternal. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting shift that began around 1750 years of our time, when workshops in Europe began to hum with new energy. Here, early mechanized looms began to find their place beside the wooden frames that had long served the craft. The air was filled with the scent of oil and wood dust, the rhythmic creak of machinery blending with the familiar sounds of weaving. These new looms, powered by simple mechanisms and sometimes even by water, allowed for a consistency and speed that astonished many. Textile workshops in England, France, and the Netherlands became the testing grounds of innovation, where artisans learned to balance the grace of handwork with the precision of moving parts. The idea of mass production was still fragile, still uncertain, but its roots were quietly forming in these dimly lit rooms. And as more of these mechanized looms appeared, threads began to move not just with the motion of the body, but with the slow, patient turning of gears, a change so subtle at first that it might have seemed almost gentle, though it would reshape the world before long. And softly, almost imperceptibly, the hum deepened, carrying us to around 1800 years of our time, when the Industrial Revolution began to unfurl like smoke over England's damp hills. The simple rhythm of the loom became the driving heartbeat of mechanized weaving. Vast mills rose beside rivers, their great wheels turning day and night, powered by water and later by steam. Inside these enormous halls, hundreds of looms clattered in unison, weaving cloth at a scale unimaginable only a few generations before. Cotton from India and the Americas flowed in, while towns like Manchester and Leeds grew into centers of industry, filled with the ceaseless rhythm of progress. Yet within this transformation, something tender remained, the memory of the handweaver's craft, the artistry that lingered in patterns and textures even when made by machine. The threads of tradition and technology intertwined, not in conflict, but in a strange, evolving harmony. The world's fabric was changing, quite literally, and though the pace was no longer slow or quiet, it carried within it echoes of the old weaving songs, softly buried beneath the churn of the new. And with a quiet continuation, the story drifts toward about 1820 years of our time, when the power loom became the centerpiece of European textile factories. It was the next gentle, though monumental, step in this long journey from thread to cloth. Driven first by water and then by steam, the power loom transformed not only how fabric was made, but where and by whom. Villages that had once spun wool in cottages found their livelihoods drawn toward cities, where the rhythmic thunder of machinery replaced the solitary hush of the spinning wheel. The new factories were vast, filled with the scent of oil and cotton dust, the air thick with the vibration of industry. Each loom could produce more in a day than a handweaver might in a week, and with it came both awe and unease. The fabric of society itself seemed to be rethreading, as skill gave way to scale, and the intimacy of the handmade yielded to the marvel of the mechanical. Yet even then, in the dim morning light filtering through factory windows, one could still see the quiet poetry of motion, the way the threads crossed and held, forming something enduring, something human, out of endless motion and sound. And in that gentle persistence, the world continued to weave itself forward. And as we drift softly into the mid-19th century, around 1850 years of our time, we find ourselves listening to the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the textile mills in the young and growing United States. The air hums with the mingled sounds of water wheels and steam engines, the scent of cotton dust hanging like a thin haze in the morning light. These mills, particularly in places like Lowell, Massachusetts, were more than just factories, they were entire ecosystems of motion and labor, powered by rivers that turned great wheels and belts, carrying that steady energy into every spinning frame and loom. The work was repetitive, mechanical, yet strangely musical, hundreds of threads moving in synchrony, weaving cloth that would travel across continents. The workers, often women known as mill girls, followed the cadence of machines with remarkable discipline, their lives structured around the shift bell and the steady clatter of wooden shuttles. Cotton from the American South fed these northern mills, creating an invisible chain of dependence that tied field to factory, human hands to humming steel. And within that web, the textile industry grew, a vast, restless organism that clothed the expanding world, one spool at a time. And softly, almost imperceptibly, the threads carry us eastward, to around 1870 years of our time, when India, whose looms had once woven the world's most coveted cottons, began to receive a new kind of weaving technology from Europe. The European looms, with their metal frames and measured precision, arrived as both promise and disruption. For centuries, Indian weavers had worked on wooden hand looms, guided by ancestral patterns passed quietly from one generation to the next. Now, these new machines brought speed, but at the cost of touch. The rhythmic, human slowness that once shaped each length of muslin or chintz began to change, replaced by the unyielding pace of industrial rhythm. Yet even as these mechanical looms spread through the colonial economy, the art of hand-weaving endured, in villages, under open roofs, where artisans continued to spin and weave by hand, preserving the texture, the breath, of the human craft. Cotton mills emerged in Bombay and Ahmedabad, blending the old with the new, and India's weaving tradition, though altered, continued to flow onward, like a river split but never stilled. And now we drift gently toward about 1900 years of our time, where in Europe, the Jacquard loom had become a quiet marvel of ingenuity and pattern. This loom, invented earlier in the century by Joseph Marie Jacquard, used punched cards to control each thread's movement, allowing complex designs to be woven automatically. It was, in essence, a mechanical memory, a precursor to the thinking logic of computers that would one day follow. Each punched card represented a decision, a thread raised, another lowered, creating patterns too intricate for the unaided human hand. Brocades, damasks, and tapestries emerged from these looms, their surfaces alive with woven flowers, vines, and mythic scenes. In workshops across France, Italy, and Britain, artisans and engineers worked together, merging art and technology into something both old and astonishingly new. The hum of these looms was softer than the thunder of factories, it was precise, deliberate, almost delicate. Each cloth bore the fingerprint of mathematics and imagination interlaced, proving that even in the age of industry, beauty could still emerge from the logic of machinery. And slowly, the weave thickened, carrying us to around 1920 years of our time, when the United States entered an era of dizzying industrial efficiency. Textile production reached heights previously unimagined. The mills of the early century grew into vast complexes powered by electricity rather than water or steam, their looms capable of weaving faster, longer, stronger. Fabrics became not only an art but a science, measured by tensile strength, thread count, and weave tightness. Synthetic fibers like rayon began to appear, spun from cellulose rather than cotton, blurring the line between natural and manufactured. Workers now tended multiple machines at once, monitoring not the gentle rhythm of the shuttle but the steady hum of power-driven steel. It was an age of production, of output, of measurable results. Yet amid this precision, there was still something quietly human, the desire to create softness, warmth, and comfort from mere strands of fiber. The machines may have changed, but the goal remained the same, to weave something that could touch the skin and soothe it, much like the way a blanket now rests over a drowsy listener, keeping them warm against the cool breath of night. And as the century turned once more toward the shadowed decade of around 1940 years of our time, weaving took on a new, urgent purpose. Across Europe, factories that once produced silk for gowns and wool for coats began to produce fabrics for uniforms, parachutes, and tents. Textiles became instruments of necessity, durable, functional, and standardized. Silk was replaced by nylon, a synthetic marvel created by chemists who sought strength and endurance in place of softness. In the hum of wartime production, the old artistry of pattern and color gave way to efficiency and resilience. Yet even here, among the gray-green tones of military cloth, the essence of weaving remained, the careful interlacing of threads, one over, one under, forming a structure that held together under pressure. It was as though the craft itself, ancient and unassuming, offered quiet stability amid chaos. Each woven sheet, each roll of fabric, carried within it the same principle that had guided humanity for millennia, that strength lies in the intertwining, in the meeting of separate threads that together become something whole. And so, in the gentle hush of around 1950 years of our time, the story glides eastward again, back to China, where silk, that most ancient of fibers, continued its serene journey into modernity. The looms of the new era were electric now, their rhythm steady and confident, yet the silk they produced still carried the same soft gleam they had held since the earliest dynasties. The craft had survived emperors, dynasties, revolutions, and still, it endured, transformed but not forgotten. Modern techniques allowed for uniformity and brilliance of color, but in quiet workshops, traditional silk weavers still worked by hand, drawing fine filaments from cocoons, twisting them into luminous threads. The air around them shimmered faintly, filled with the same whispering sound that had once echoed through the halls of imperial Suzhou. And so, silk, the most delicate of human inventions, continued to bridge the ancient and the new, its surface reflecting not just light, but time itself. It reminded the world, softly and without insistence, that no matter how far technology advances, the essence of weaving, the act of joining threads into harmony, remains as constant and tender as breath. And so, as the world drifted softly into the quiet hum of the later 20th century, threads once spun by hand now slipped through the fingers of machines that never tired. Around the year 1960 of our time, in India's growing cities, Delhi, Bombay, and Coimbatore among them, the sound of looms multiplied until it seemed as though the air itself pulsed with rhythm. Mechanized weaving expanded swiftly, shimmering alongside the hum of urban life. Factories rose where once only hand looms had stood, their iron frames catching the dust and sunlight in patterns not so different from the warp and weft they carried. Yet, within this mechanical dance, a curious harmony persisted, traditional techniques lingered beside the new. Cotton, so deeply rooted in India's soil and spirit, continued to move through both worlds, the patient hands of village artisans and the steady motions of machines. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting detail, much of India's mechanized weaving grew not merely from invention, but from adaptation, Old English looms reimagined, belts refitted, local engineers experimenting by lantern light to coax foreign machines into Indian conditions of heat and monsoon. The result was not just fabric, but a living bridge between memory and modernity, between the quiet village courtyard and the crowded factory floor. And as we move gently onward, the air around the year 1970 of our time shimmered with a new kind of thread, one not born from cotton, wool, or silk, but from chemistry and invention. Across Europe, the weaving rooms filled with the faint, plasticky scent of synthetic fibers, nylon, polyester, acrylic. Each strand was strangely perfect, endlessly repeatable, and resistant to time in a way that natural fibers never could be. Weaving, that ancient art of interlacing one line with another, now embraced materials that came not from field or cocoon but from laboratory vats and industrial dreams. These fibers, fine and strong, allowed designers to conjure textiles that glimmered, stretched, or repelled water, all things that once would have seemed quietly magical. And yet, woven among these new materials, one could still find whispers of tradition, patterns borrowed from medieval tapestries, Jacquard looms humming with motifs inspired by fields of wheat or seaside lace. It was as though the past and future had found a single loom to share, both laying their threads side by side, letting the fabric of human imagination unfold in unexpected color. With the drifting calm of progress, the decades turned again, and around the year 1980 of our time, weaving began to feel like a conversation between continents. From Japan came minimalist textures, from Peru, patterns of mountain geometry, from India and Africa, vivid dyes and handwoven stories that defied industrial sameness. Global textile design became an art of blending, traditional weavers and modern designers meeting at looms that now stretched across oceans. Museums began to collect not only ancient tapestries but contemporary woven art, where silk met steel, and cotton mingled with glass fiber. But first, just a soft little pause. For this extra glimmer of wonder, in these years, computers too began to whisper to the looms. Punch cards, once invented for the Jacquard, evolved into digital programs, and the fabric became a kind of code, a material language where every thread was both art and algorithm. And then, as twilight settled over the close of the century, around the year 1990 of our time, China rose once more as the quiet giant of the weaving world. Industrial weaving flourished in vast, humming cities like Suzhou, Hangzhou, and Shanghai, where silk had been born centuries before. Factories expanded outward like intricate patterns on a brocade, feeding the world's growing appetite for fabric. Textiles were no longer just for clothing, they became architecture, art, insulation, design. Yet even in the midst of that industrial pulse, there was still something poetic about it all, the faint sound of shuttles moving back and forth, not unlike the centuries-old rhythm that had once filled courtyard workshops. Every roll of fabric carried with it both the scent of machine oil and the echo of ancient hands, working in harmony with progress rather than against it. And softly, as we step into the dawn of the new millennium, around the year 2000 of our time, the story of weaving took yet another gentle turn, back toward its roots. In India, where spinning and weaving had once been the heartbeat of daily life, artisans returned to their looms not out of necessity but out of reverence. Hand-woven cotton and silk became treasures of cultural heritage, protected, celebrated, displayed. Initiatives rose to keep the craft alive, to ensure that each thread still carried a touch of humanity. In small workshops, one might find an old weaver teaching a child the delicate tension between warp and weft, or a designer blending old dye recipes with modern palettes. The hum of machinery had not vanished, but it coexisted now with the soft, steady beat of hand and shuttle, a reminder that weaving, at its heart, is not just about cloth, but about connection. And as the threads continue to intertwine, they whisper the same story they always have, that every strand, whether born from silkworm, cotton boll, or polymer, still seeks the same quiet unity when woven gently into place. And so, with a quiet hum of circuitry and light, the story of weaving drifted gently into the years around 2010 of our time. The world, by then, had grown softly luminous with digital rhythm, machines that could think just enough to weave on their own, guided by invisible hands of code. In vast workshops and silent factories, looms no longer waited for a human touch to set them in motion, instead, they listened to the soft pulse of computers, each command like a whisper translated into motion. Threads moved with perfect timing, patterns blossomed across fabric with almost impossible precision. A single digital file could summon entire tapestries of color, texture, and form, woven in moments that once would have taken weeks of human labor. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, though we speak of automation as a new thing, its spirit was born long ago, in the old Jacquard cards that guided silk looms centuries earlier. Those punched holes were the ancestors of binary code, and in a way, every modern automated loom is simply the Jacquard's great-grandchild, smarter, faster, but still speaking the same quiet language of pattern and repetition. And yet, amid all this technological wonder, many weavers still kept a hand near the shuttle, tending machines as though they were living companions, not tools. They listened to their rhythm, adjusted the threads, and in those small gestures, the human heart still lingered, woven delicately between pixels and thread. Drifting softly onward, the world around the year 2020 of our time began to murmur with a different kind of awareness, a yearning for balance, for gentleness, for care. The weaving world, like so many others, turned its gaze toward sustainability. In workshops small and large, weavers began to ask tender questions: where does this cotton come from? Who dyes this wool? What happens to the fabric when its use has ended? And so began a slow, thoughtful shift. Dyes grew softer, drawn from plants rather than chemicals. Fibers were reclaimed, recycled, or grown organically, their textures warmer, their origins kinder. Even great factories reimagined their processes, recycling water, reducing waste, capturing energy from the very hum of their machines. But perhaps the most quietly moving transformation was in the mindset itself. Weaving was no longer seen only as production, but as stewardship. To weave sustainably became a form of care, an act of responsibility toward both people and planet. But first, just a slow little pause. For this gentle reflection, the oldest looms were always sustainable by necessity, powered by muscle, by wind, by patience. In a way, the modern shift toward eco-conscious weaving was less an innovation and more a remembering, a returning to that slow rhythm of balance that once defined all making. And as we float softly into the present, around the year 2025 of our time, the threads of technology and tradition begin to intertwine in the most quietly astonishing ways. Smart textiles emerge like dreams from the loom, fabrics that can sense, respond, even communicate. Some shimmer with threads of conductive fiber, allowing light or warmth to pass through their weave. Others monitor the body, adjusting their texture or temperature like gentle companions. The loom, that ancient tool, now hums with digital intelligence, yet its motion remains deeply familiar, the same rhythm that once echoed in ancient courtyards and medieval workshops. Designers work side by side with engineers, merging ancestral craftsmanship with sensors and circuits. But first, a slow, curious detour. For this extra fascinating thought, even the idea of smart cloth carries an echo of the past, for early weavers too sought ways to make fabric do more, to insulate, to protect, to signify. The only difference now is the language of the threads, the quiet circuitry where once there was only spin and fiber. And so, the loom becomes a bridge once again, between touch and data, past and future, hand and machine. It reminds us, with every passing shuttle, that no matter how far technology carries us, the act of weaving will always remain an art of connection, the bringing together of separate strands into something whole, patient, and softly alive. This is not exciting. Not even a little bit. And that is just perfect. If your eyes are closed, if your thoughts are drifting, then my job here is done for today. Thank you for spending this unremarkable moment with me. You have listened to The Sleepy Sloth, where uninteresting things become the softest lullabies.